I am going to open this one on a grey October morning in the year 1847, in the yard of a coaching inn on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, at the precise moment a man of considerable fortune and considerably more pride made the kind of mistake that follows a person all the way to the altar, and, if he is lucky, makes him laugh about it for the rest of his life. He was not laughing yet. That part comes later. Pull your chair a little closer, my friends. The fire is good tonight, and so is this story, I promise you that. The man in question was Aldous Merritt, Viscount Dunmore, and he had been travelling since before dawn. His carriage had thrown a wheel outside Harrogate. His valet had sprained an ankle stepping down to assess the damage, and the coaching inn at Kettlebridge was not, it turned out, the sort of establishment that a viscount's household used in the ordinary run of things. The yard smelled of wet straw and horses, and something unidentifiable that Aldous chose not to think about too carefully. He was 34 years old. He had inherited his title at 22, and he had spent the intervening years managing an estate that his father had left in a condition best described as quietly catastrophic. He had fixed it. He had fixed it through 12 years of careful work and uncomfortable decisions, and not one penny wasted. And now, at last, he was going to do the thing he had been putting off since his mother had started leaving strategically placed copies of Debrett's on the breakfast table. He was going to find a wife, not for love. He was sensible about this. Love was a luxury that men in his position could not always afford. What he needed was a woman of good family and reliable temperament who would not run up ruinous debts or embarrass him at dinner. And what he was going to get, if everything went according to plan, was Miss Rosalind Ashcroft of Kettlebridge Hall, whose father held 17,000 acres of the best farmland in the North Riding, and whose dowry was by all accounts substantial. He had never met her. He was correcting that oversight now. The coaching inn yard was busy. He stepped out of the carriage. Carefully, because the ground was uneven and the wet cobblestones had a treacherous look, and nearly walked directly into a woman who was arguing with an ostler about the fitness of a grey mare for hard travel. He noticed several things in rapid succession. She was perhaps 28 or 29, which he registered only because she looked too young to be speaking with quite so much authority. She was wearing a coat that had once been good quality and was now honestly worn at the cuffs. Her hair was escaping its pins in a way that suggested it had started the morning very differently. There was a smear of something, mud possibly, along the back of one gloved hand. She was not, in short, the kind of woman who was usually arguing with ostlers. What she was saying, with the patient firmness of someone who has already explained this twice and does not intend to do so a third time, was that the mare's near foreleg was carrying heat, and that if Mr. Briggs sent her out on the moor road in this condition he would have a lame horse and a very angry livery bill before noon. The ostler did not look convinced. Aldous Merritt, Viscount Dunmore, looked at the woman in the worn coat, and then at the mare, and then at the woman again, and made his first mistake. "You there," he said, "and I want you to note, my friends, the precise tone of those two words, because it is the tone that set everything in motion. Not unkind, exactly, not cruel, but thoroughly, completely certain that it was the appropriate way to address the person standing before him. Has anyone sent word to the hall? I am expected." She turned around. Her eyes were dark brown, and they were assessing him in a way that he was not perhaps entirely accustomed to being assessed. "Expected by whom?" she said. "By the Ashcroft family," he said. "I am Viscount Dunmore. I imagine there is someone from the house who was meant to meet me here." He looked past her toward the inn door. "Could you find out for me? And perhaps see that my valet gets somewhere to sit. He has injured himself." There was a pause. The woman looked at him, then at the mare, then, very briefly, at something in the middle distance that might have been the horizon or might have been Patience itself, walking slowly away. "Of course," she said. "I will see to it." She saw to it. She found the inn's boy and sent him for a chair for the valet. She spoke a quiet word to the ostler, who subsided. She turned back to Aldous with her hands clasped in front of her and asked with perfect composure whether he required refreshment while his carriage was seen to. He said tea would be acceptable. She brought him tea. She brought it herself, which he noticed as slightly irregular, but attributed to the inn being understaffed. She set it down on the table by the window without rattling the cup, which he also noticed because his last housemaid had never managed it. He thanked her without looking up from the letter he had opened. She went back outside. The mare, he noted, through the window, was not sent out on the moor road. He did not think about that. He was thinking about the letter, which was from his solicitor and contained information that required careful reading. He did not think about the woman in the worn coat at all. This was his second mistake, and considerably more expensive than the first. The Ashcroft carriage arrived 40 minutes later. Delayed, the coachman explained apologetically, by a tree come down across the lane in last night's wind. Aldous finished his tea, collected his valet, and was handed up into a very well-appointed vehicle that smelled of good leather and beeswax, and was driven through gates that were, he noticed with professional approval, recently rehung and properly level. Kettlebridge Hall was a handsome house, not fashionable. The architecture was 60 years out of date, but well maintained in a way that spoke of genuine care rather than recent expenditure to impress. The gravel was raked. The windows were clean. The ivy on the east wing was clipped back neatly from the sills. He approved of all of this. He was shown into a drawing room where Mr. Hugh Ashcroft, a large, cheerful man of about 60, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors and was not sorry about it, stood up to shake his hand with every evidence of genuine welcome. "Lord Dunmore, capital timing. Come in, come in. Dreadful roads today, I imagine. Rosalind was worried you'd be delayed all afternoon." Aldous accepted the handshake and looked around the room. There were two other people present. One was an older woman, Mrs. Ashcroft, he presumed, seated by the fire with a piece of needlework she was not actually looking at. The other was the woman from the coaching-in yard, now without the worn coat, standing beside the window with a cup of tea she had apparently just been handed, and an expression he could not immediately read. She was wearing a grey wool dress that fit her correctly, and a small gold brooch at her collar that was, he suddenly noticed, exactly the kind of jewelry worn by women who do not need to display their wealth, because the house around them does it for them. He stopped. She looked at him with those dark brown eyes and said nothing. "My lord," said Hugh Ashcroft with the expansive goodwill of a man who found the whole world amusing, "may I present my daughter, Miss Rosalind Ashcroft. She will have been the one who made sure you were properly seen to at the inn. She was up there seeing about the mare." There is a particular kind of silence that descends on a man when he understands, all at once, and with perfect clarity exactly what he has done. This was that silence. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then Rosalind Ashcroft said, very pleasantly, "I do hope the tea was satisfactory, Lord Dunmore." He wanted, very badly, to say something that would undo it. There was nothing that would undo it. He had handed her, a woman of property, the daughter of a man whose land he could see from the upstairs windows, a request to fetch his tea and find out if anyone had come to meet him, in precisely the tone one used with persons whose names one did not need to know. He said, "Miss Ashcroft, I owe you an apology." "Not at all," she said. "It was a reasonable assumption." It was not a reasonable assumption. They both knew it was not a reasonable assumption. She said it anyway. And that, my friends, is the thing I want you to hold on to, because that small piece of grace, extended to a man who had not earned it, is where this story really begins. He stayed 4 days. This was the plan. 4 days to assess the situation, meet the family, determine whether the match was sensible on both sides. Mr. Ashcroft was easy company. Mrs. Ashcroft was sharp-eyed and quiet, and clearly reserving her judgment, and Rosalind, Miss Ashcroft, was precisely the kind of person who became more interesting the longer you were in a room with her, which Aldous Merritt had not anticipated, and did not entirely know what to do with. She knew everything about the estate. Not in the way that daughters of landowning family sometimes knew things. Abstractly, theoretically, as facts recited from a distance, but with the close, specific knowledge of someone who had walked every field and argued about every drainage plan and stayed up until 2 in the morning going over the ledgers when the yields came in badly 3 years running. He found this out on the second day when he asked, carefully, not wanting to seem too commercially minded, about the land management. She looked at him for a moment as if deciding something. Then she said, "The North Fields were underperforming when I took over the accounts 6 years ago. We've rerouted the drainage and rotated out of winter wheat on the clay sections. This year was the first year we were satisfied with the yields." "You took over the accounts," he said. "My father's eyes," she said, "are not what they were." It was said simply, without apology or self-congratulation, and it told him more about her in one sentence than the entire morning had told him about anything. Now, I ask you to consider something, because here is where I find this story most interesting. Lord Dunmore had arrived at Kettlebridge with a perfectly sensible plan. He needed a wife of good family and reliable temperament. He had not been looking for a woman who could read a drainage report or who knew the difference between clay soil and loam by the feel of it, or who had spent 6 years quietly keeping 17,000 acres from going the wrong way while her father's eyesight failed. He had not been looking for that. But here is what I have learned, my friends, from a great many years of watching people fail to find what they are looking for. The things we are not looking for have a way of making themselves impossible to ignore. On the third evening, they walked out after dinner toward the Northfield boundary. Miss Ashcroft had suggested it. "Fresh air," he said, "good for the digestion," and then had been called back inside by a matter relating to a tenant's roof, with the cheerful absent-mindedness of a man who was perhaps not entirely absent-minded at all. They walked in silence for a while. The light was going off the hills in long gold stripes, and the air smelled of turned earth, and something heathery that Aldous did not have a name for. "You are nothing like I expected," he said. He had not meant to say it aloud. "What did you expect?" she said, without particular rancor. "I don't know precisely." He considered this honestly. "Someone more," he stopped. "Decorative," she suggested. "I was going to say less certain of herself." She was quiet for a moment. The path curved around the edge of a copse of old beeches, and she walked it with the ease of someone who had walked it 1,000 times without thinking about it. "I have had," she said at last, "a number of gentlemen come to inspect this estate disguised as coming to meet me. I find that certainty is useful in those circumstances." He felt the words land somewhere in the vicinity of his conscience. "I owe you a second apology," he said. "You don't," she said. "You were honest about it when my father asked you your situation. Honest men who arrive with uncomfortable intentions are a great deal easier to manage than charming ones who conceal them." "You knew," he said slowly, "from the beginning." "My father tells me everything," she said. "He told me what your solicitor wrote to his solicitor, and what you needed, and what you were hoping for." She paused. "He also told me that you had spent 12 years restoring an estate that your father left in poor repair through your own work, without selling land or defaulting on a single obligation." Another pause, a shorter one, that part I found relevant. He looked at her. The last light was going off the hills, and her profile was calm and clear against it, and she was looking at the boundary fence with the expression of someone who is not going to say anything more on the subject until she has decided what she thinks about it. He went inside and lay awake for a considerable time. He thought about the tea. He thought about the mare's leg, which had indeed been carrying heat. He had checked the animal himself the following morning, and Miss Ashcroft had been right, and the ostler had been wrong, and there was an entire village of decisions just like that, one behind those steady brown eyes that he had looked directly at and failed to see. He thought about what she had said. Honest men who arrive with uncomfortable intentions are a great deal easier to manage than charming ones who conceal them. He thought about the fact that she had extended him that grace at the beginning, Not all right, not forgiven, but possible, and that she had done it without any visible expectation of reward for it. He thought about the estate, which was well run and well loved, and had been kept that way, for 6 years, by a woman who knew every field and every figure, and apparently every horse's leg. He thought about his own estate, which he had kept going through 12 years of stubbornness and careful work, and what it might feel like to have someone beside him who understood, from the inside, what that kind of work required. He had come here for a sensible arrangement. He was lying awake at 2 in the morning, thinking about brown eyes and the way she had said relevant, and he had to be honest with himself at least, about what that meant. The 4th morning was clear and cold and sharply beautiful, in the way that October mornings in Yorkshire sometimes were, as though the landscape was apologizing for everything that came before by being entirely, briefly perfect. He found her in the kitchen garden. Of course he did. She was examining a section of the south-facing wall where something had been trained up on wire. Fruit trees, he thought, though they were past season now, and she had her hands in her coat pockets and was frowning at the mortar between the bricks with the expression of someone making a mental note. He had rehearsed for approximately 2 hours before breakfast what he was going to say. He had 3 versions. The most sensible one was the shortest one. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. She turned around. "I came here," he said, "to make a practical arrangement. I was honest about that from the beginning, or at least honest with your father, which amounts to the same thing in this house." He looked at her steadily. "I find that my position has changed." "Has it?" she said. "Not a question precisely." "I don't want a practical arrangement," he said. "I did when I arrived. I don't anymore." He stopped. Then, because 12 years of managing an estate had given him, above all things, a distaste for imprecision, "I want to ask if I might come back. Not to inspect anything. Not because your father's 17,000 acres are excellent farmland, which they are, but because I would, very much, like to continue the conversation." She looked at him for a moment. The wind moved through the espaliered branches on the wall and scattered a few dead leaves across the path between them. "You nearly sent me to fetch your luggage," she said. "I know," he said. "You said you there. I know that too. And you gave me." She reached into her coat pocket and produced, with the timing of someone who has been waiting for this moment since the coaching-in yard, a coin, a shilling. She held it out in her palm. "In case," she said with perfect gravity, "you'd like it back." He looked at the shilling for a long moment. Then he said, "And this, my friends, is the sentence I have been keeping for you. Keep it. I expect I owe you rather more than that." She kept it. He came back 3 weeks later, and then again a fortnight after that, and by December there was an understanding between them that was not romantic in the grand fashionable sense. There was no moonlight, no sonnet, no dramatic gesture on a hillside, but was instead the quieter and more durable kind, built out of long conversations about drainage and crop rotation, and the precise right moment to rehang a gate, and the growing, comfortable certainty on both sides that the other person was going to keep making sense long after the novelty wore off. They were married in April, in the church at Kettlebridge, with Mr. Ashcroft beaming the entire time, and Mrs. Ashcroft crying into a handkerchief that she had prepared in advance, which told you everything you needed to know about her. And in the years that followed, Aldous Merritt, Lord Dunmore, became known in the county as a man of good sense and unusual judgment. His estate flourished, his wife's estate flourished, and when people came to call and found her in the garden or the yard, or bent over the account books at the library table and made the mistake of looking past her for the woman of the house, well, she had a shilling for them. She kept a small jar of them on the mantelpiece, as it happened, for exactly this purpose, and she found it funnier every single time. And that, my dear friends, is the story I had for you tonight. A man who arrived looking for a practical arrangement, and found, instead, someone who had already taken his measure and decided, quietly and without fuss, that he might be worth the trouble of correcting. If you found your way to the end of this one, I am glad of your company. There is more where this came from. here at Moonlight at Bellwood if you choose to stay. The fire will be lit, and the next story already waiting, and I do not think you will be disappointed. Until then, my friends. Until then.